The void between stars was cold in ways that had no name in any living language. Grand Admiral Vorex, 7 of the Hegemony Dominion stood at the observation deck of his flagship, the Eternal Verdict, and watched the pale smear of humanity's solar system resolve into something recognizable on his tactical display. 612 warships stretched behind him in formation. 12 dreadnoughts, 44 battleships, 118 heavy cruisers, the rest a cascade of destroyers and frigates that filled the sensor screen like a swarm of teeth. The greatest fleet the Hegemony had assembled in 3 centuries. And they had assembled it for this. For humanity. Vorex, 7 almost laughed. Almost. He was too dignified for that. Sensor readout on the human defense perimeter, he said without turning from the viewport. His sensor chief, Drath, answered immediately. 43 warships confirmed, Admiral. 14 of what they classify as battlecruisers, 20 destroyers, 9 frigates. They appear to be holding position at roughly 1.2 million kilometers from their third planet. A pause. Their largest vessel is approximately 1/4 the displacement of our smallest dreadnought, sir. 43. Vorex, 7 let the number sit in his mind like a stone dropped into still water. He had brought 612 ships. The Hegemony High Council had argued it was excessive. They were right, of course. It was excessive. But Vorex, 7 believed in sending a message that could not be misinterpreted, a message written in fire and wreckage so clear that no species in this arm of the galaxy would need to ask twice what happened to the humans. They had refused integration. They had refused to cede their star system to hegemony expansion. They had, most offensively of all, told the hegemony's diplomatic delegation to, and he was quoting directly from the translated communication here, go find somewhere else to be. So now they would be removed. It was simple. It was inevitable. It was, by any military calculus he could construct, going to take approximately 4 hours. What are they doing? He asked, watching the sensor returns. The human ships weren't moving. They were just sitting there in a loose formation around the inner system, their energy signatures quiet, almost passive. Nothing, Admiral. They appear to be waiting. Waiting, Vorex, 7 repeated. He turned from the viewport and settled into his command throne. For what, precisely, do they think they're waiting? No one on the bridge had an answer. Signal the fleet, he said, pulling up the tactical grid. Standard assault formation. Advance at 1/4 drive until we reach engagement range, then full offensive. Priority targets are their largest ships. I want this system pacified before the next light cycle. He looked at the screen once more and shook his head slowly. 43 ships. These creatures have had faster-than-light travel for less than 2,000 years and they think those 43 ships are going to stop 600. What an extraordinary way to die. The Eternal Verdict shuddered with the deep vibration of its drive system spinning up. Around it, 611 other warships did the same, and together they began to move, a tide of metal and energy rolling toward the inner system. On the human flagship, the carrier ISS Enduring, Admiral Chen Wei stood at her own command display and watched the hegemony fleet advance. She was a compact woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back sharply from her face, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had spent 30 years making decisions that other people had to live and die by. She looked at the sensor readout. 612 warships. She'd known the number for 6 days, since the outer pickets had first spotted them dropping out of FTL at the edge of the system. She had spent those 6 days doing exactly 2 things. First, deploying her 43 ships into the positions she needed them in. Second, transmitting a single encoded signal on a frequency that no hegemony sensor array would recognize as a communications band, because it wasn't a communications band by any conventional definition. It was a gravitational pulse modulated at a very specific frequency. A frequency that had not been used in 1100 years. A frequency that humanity had agreed, a very long time ago, would mean one thing and one thing only. Come home. Admiral, said her tactical officer, Lieutenant Voss, the hegemony fleet has crossed the 1 million kilometer threshold. They're coming in hot. I see them. She straightened. All ships, this is Admiral Chen. Hold position. Do not fire. Do not maneuver. I want the hegemony fleet to commit to their attack vector and I want them focused entirely on us. A brief pause. The cavalry is coming. We just need to hold their attention for about 20 minutes. On the bridge of the hegemony dreadnought Unwavering Truth, Battle Commander Shex watched the human formation with the mild curiosity of someone watching insects arrange themselves. They're not moving, she said. Perhaps they think their formation will hold us, suggested her weapons officer. Their formation, Shex said flatly, is 43 ships. My dreadnought alone outmasses their entire battle line. She pulled up the firing solution on the two nearest human battlecruisers. Lock primary plasma lances. Target their lead ships. Let's give them a demonstration of what. Contact, said the sensor officer, and something in his voice made Shex stop. What contact? I'm not sure. I'm reading a gravitational distortion. Multiple gravitational distortions. Behind us. Deep void, approximately 6 million kilometers back along our approach vector, but it's spreading fast, Admiral, he stopped talking. Every screen on the bridge flickered. The distortions weren't multiple. They were thousands. Vorex 7 felt it before his sensors confirmed it. A pressure change, somehow, though there was no air in space to carry pressure, and yet every being on the bridge of the eternal verdict went still at the same moment, the way animals go still when something older and larger moves nearby. Then Drath's voice came through clipped and strange. Admiral. I need you to look at the aft sensors. Vorex 7 turned. The void behind his fleet was opening. That was the only word for it. Space itself seemed to be parting, folding back from points of blinding white light that were emerging one by one and then in dozens and then in hundreds, each one resolving as sensors caught up into the hard angular outline of a warship. Not small ships. Not human ships of the kind he'd been briefed on, with their relatively crude energy signatures and modest mass displacement. These were enormous. Each one that his sensors managed to lock onto registered a mass displacement that put them in the dreadnought class, and they kept coming. They kept coming and the sensor display, designed to track the movements of an entire fleet action, began to struggle. Numbers climbed. 50. 100. 300. 600. What, said Vorex 7, very quietly, is that? Drath's voice had lost any professional composure. Sir, I'm reading over 1,000 contacts. Over 1,000. Their drive signatures are unlike anything in our database. The emission profiles don't match any known human technology. They're not matching any known technology at all. The metallurgical resonance on those hulls, Admiral, the computer is saying those ships are old. I mean genuinely old. The surface oxidation patterns alone suggest. He stopped. Looked at his screen again. Ran the calculation again. Sir. Those hulls are 1 million years old. The bridge of the eternal verdict went absolutely silent. On the lead ship of the emerging fleet, a vessel so large its shadow fell across 3 hegemony dreadnoughts simultaneously, Fleet Commander Ela stood at the command altar. Not a command throne, not a tactical console, but a stone altar inlaid with circuits that had been running continuously for longer than most current civilizations had been counting time, and felt the warmth of the signal in her bones. She was the 47,000th Fleet Commander of the Void Armada. She had been born in the deep between stars. Her grandparents had been born in the deep between stars. The chain of commanders stretched back past memory, past record in any conventional sense, to an origin point her people thought of the way surface humans thought of myths. A time when the first ships had been launched from a blue-green world by people who had looked up at the stars and decided, with the particular stubbornness that apparently never left human blood no matter how many generations passed, that if anyone was coming for their children someday, their children were going to be ready. 1,000,000 years of ready. Her fleet, 1,412 warships, ranging from destroyers the size of a city block to carriers so large they generated their own gravitational fields, had spent 1,000,000 years in the deep void, traveling the long routes between star systems, maintaining themselves, updating their weapons, training their crews across generation after generation, never stopping, never sleeping in the way that surface civilizations slept. They had watched empires rise from the inner stars and collapse and rise again. They had watched a dozen species reach for the stars and a dozen more be consumed by their neighbors. They had received updates, periodically, from the signal buoys humanity had seeded across the void. They knew what the hegemony was. They had been tracking it for 200 years. And now the signal had come. The frequency that meant come home. Ela touched the communication crystal at the altar center. Her voice went out across the fleet on a band that humans had been using for 1,000,000 years. All ships. This is Fleet Commander Ela of the Void Armada, 47,000th of that name. The signal has been given. Formation Omega. Advance. She paused, and when she spoke again there was something ancient and completely steady in her voice. For Earth. Vorex 7 recovered faster than most would have. He was, genuinely, a talented admiral, and talent has a way of asserting itself even in the face of the incomprehensible. He began issuing orders before his brain had fully accepted what his sensors were telling him. Full combat speed. All ships, concentrate fire on the emerging contacts. We hit them while they're still in transition. Sir, Drath said, they're not in transition. They've completed emergence. All contacts fully stable. Then we. The first shot from the Void Armada hit the Hegemony destroyer cutting wind before anyone on the Eternal Verdict had finished a sentence. It wasn't a plasma lance shot. It wasn't a particle beam. It was a kinetic slug, depleted uranium and tungsten composite, 80 centimeters across, fired from a magnetic accelerator running the full length of a 2-kilometer warship, and it arrived at the cutting wind at 0.4 the speed of light. The cutting wind's energy shields, which were genuinely excellent, did exactly nothing. Energy shields stop energy. They stop plasma, they stop particle beams, they stop laser fire. They do not stop physics. The slug hit the destroyer amidships, and the cutting wind ceased to be a warship and became a rapidly expanding cloud of debris moving at high velocity, and the debris hit 2 nearby frigates hard enough to crack their hulls. Kinetic weapons, Drath whispered. They're using kinetic weapons. Our shields won't stop them, Vorex 7 finished. He felt the floor drop out of his certainty in the way that a very high cliff drops out from under someone who has stepped off the edge without meaning to. Evasive maneuvers. All ships, evasive. The second salvo came from 600 different Void Armada ships simultaneously. On the human battlecruiser ISS Sarajevo, Captain Torres watched the Hegemony fleet ahead of him through the tactical display and allowed himself a quiet exhale of relief. He'd been holding position for 22 minutes, watching 612 enemy warships close the gap, and he had done it without breaking, without ordering his formation to scatter, without doing anything other than what Admiral Chen had told him to do. Trust the signal, she'd said. Trust the fleet. Now his rear sensors were showing him the Void Armada, and he did the thing that humans do when something enormous and incomprehensible saves their lives, which is to say something small and completely inadequate to the moment. Huh, said Torres. There really are 1,000 of them. Captain, said his weapons officer, Hegemony fleet is breaking formation. They're starting to pivot. Of course they are. He opened the ship-wide channel. All hands, this is Torres. The cavalry arrived. Now we do our part. Target the hegemony ships in our engagement zone. Mark 7 railguns free to fire. Let's show them what Earth built for the last 2,000 years, and let's show them why it was worth building. All weapons free. The Sarajevo's railguns discharged with a sound like thunder compressed into a single hammer blow, and 14 tungsten penetrators crossed the gap to a hegemony battleship at 0. 3 lightspeed, and the hegemony battleship came apart in 4 places. Vorek 7's fleet was caught in a trap it had no tactical language for. In front of them, 43 human ships that had been passive and waiting were now firing with terrifying accuracy, their kinetic weapons punching through hegemony shields like they weren't there. Behind them, more than 1,400 ancient warships were advancing at combat speed, each one carrying weapons that a million years of refinement had made so precise and so powerful that individual shots were disabling dreadnought-class vessels. The hegemony fleet had superior numbers only if you counted the ships that were currently on fire. Admiral, Shex's voice came over the command channel, strained now, the composure gone, the bright horizon is gone. The Iron Dominion has lost primary power. I have 6 ships with critical hull breaches in the first 2 minutes of contact. What are your orders? Reform on the carrier group, Vorek 7 said, and he was angry at himself for how tight his voice had become. We push through the smaller fleet in front of us. Their 43 ships can't stop our dreadnoughts at close range. Sir, Drath said, the ancient fleet is accelerating. They're going to intercept before we reach the inner formation. How fast are they moving? Closing velocity approximately 55,000 kilometers per second, Admiral. Vorek 7 stared at the number. His own best dreadnoughts at combat speed reached 30,000. That's not possible. Ships that size cannot achieve. They have, sir. In the center of the Void Armada's advance formation, Fleet Commander Ela was watching the battle unfold with 6 simultaneous tactical displays and the deep-patterned calm of someone who had trained for this engagement for her entire life and whose ancestors had trained for it for 1,000 generations before her. The hegemony fleet was good. She acknowledged that privately. They were reorganizing faster than she'd expected, and their plasma lance fire was accurate enough that several of her outer destroyers had taken hits to non-essential systems. But their ships had been built for a galaxy where everyone used energy weapons. When you built your armor to disperse plasma and your shields to absorb particle beams, you built it wrong for what the Void Armada was going to do to you. Her fleet's kinetic accelerators were firing in rolling volleys, each ship in sequence to maintain continuous fire while individual capacitors recharged, and the effect was a relentless stream of hypersonic mass that hegemony shields simply could not engage. Fleet Commander, said her tactical second, the hegemony dreadnoughts are attempting a breakthrough toward the inner fleet. 3 dreadnoughts, bearing 274, coming fast. Detach the Ancestor's Fist and its escort group, Ela said. Tell Captain Mori I want those dreadnoughts stopped 300,000 kilometers from the inner defense line. Not damaged. Stopped. Understood. The Ancestor's Fist was one of the Void Armada's carrier dreadnoughts, a vessel 11 kilometers long whose keel had been laid down when the species it now went to defend had been painting cave walls and learning to make fire. It had been refitted approximately 6,000 times since then. Its current armament included 48 primary kinetic lances, 16 secondary accelerators, a point defense grid that could track and intercept individual projectiles at a rate of 2,000 per second, and something that didn't exist in any hegemony database because humanity had invented it in isolation over 800,000 years ago. A gravitic shear cannon, which didn't fire anything at all but instead created a temporary intense gravitational gradient that pulled on everything with mass, including the mass of a hegemony dreadnought structural members, pulling in 6 different directions simultaneously. The lead hegemony dreadnought, the Eternal Verdict itself, hit the edge of the Ancestor's Fist's engagement zone and its sensors immediately registered the power buildup. Drath turned from his console with a look on his face that Vorex 7 had never seen on a hegemony officer. Pure, clean, uncomplicated fear. "Sir, I'm reading a gravitic emission from the lead ancient warship. I don't have a weapons classification for it. I don't have a classification for it at all. It's..." The gravitic shear cannon fired. The eternal vertex frame groaned in a way that metal should not groan. Every being on the bridge felt it in their skeletons, a pulling sensation in every direction at once, as if the universe had briefly disagreed about which way was down. 3 deck plates buckled. 2 support struts in the engineering section sheared cleanly. The primary plasma lance array twisted in its housing. None of that was critical. What was critical was the secondary reactor, which was mounted on dampening struts that were not designed for cross-directional stress loading, and the secondary reactor's dampening struts failed, and the reactor went into emergency shutdown, and the eternal verdict dropped out of combat speed with its power grid running on reserves. "Damage report," Vorex 7 said, and he was proud that his voice stayed level. "Secondary reactor offline. Primary shields at 40% and dropping. Hull stress fractures across decks 12 through 19. A pause. "Admiral, the Sovereign Lance and the Perfect Order have taken similar hits. The Perfect Order is not responding to signals." What was that weapon? Nobody answered. Nobody had an answer. On Admiral Chen's display, the battle was becoming cleaner. Cleaner in the way a storm becomes cleaner once you realize it's heading away from you. The hegemony fleet had lost its coherence in the first 6 minutes of engagement with the Void Armada, breaking into clusters as individual captains tried to find a response to weapons their engineering had never anticipated. Those clusters were being methodically engaged. She watched a hegemony battleship group of 7 vessels attempt to break left of the Armada's advance and run for open space. 3 Void Armada cruisers intercepted them in 90 seconds and the engagement lasted 4 minutes, and when it was over 5 of the 7 hegemony battleships were debris and the other 2 were broadcasting distress signals. "Admiral," said Voss, "hegemony fleet is fragmenting. Multiple groups breaking formation. I'm reading attempted FTL spin-ups from at least 40 contacts. Are any of them making it? 3 so far. The rest are being interdicted." She paused. "Fleet Commander Ela's ships are very fast, Admiral." Chen nodded. "Send my regards to the Fleet Commander. Tell her we're moving our formation forward to assist with the inner engagement zone." She looked at the tactical screen and at the number she hadn't let herself think about too carefully for the last 6 days, because it was a number that could buckle your knees if you let it. 612 warships had entered this system. Roughly 70 were still combat effective. In 11 minutes. "All ships advance," she said. "Let's finish this." Vorex 7 made his last tactical decision with a clarity that he would later, assuming he survived to have a later, grudgingly respect in himself. He wasn't going to win. He'd understood that in the second minute of the engagement and had spent several minutes refusing to understand it, which was a luxury that a fleet commander couldn't afford. He had perhaps 60 combat-effective ships remaining. He had lost 2 of his 3 surviving dreadnoughts in the last 4 minutes to the ancient fleet's gravitic weapons. His sensor officer was crying quietly at his station, which was not a thing hegemony officers did, and was doing it without apparently noticing, which told Vorex 7 something about what Drath's sensors were showing him. He opened the fleet-wide command channel. "All ships, this is Admiral Vorex 7. Break off. Survival formation. Make for the jump point at bearing 117 and engage FTL as soon as you have a solution. This is not a retreat." He stopped. Restarted. "This is a retreat. Get out. Now." The surviving hegemony ships ran. Some of them made it. Shexa's battlecruiser was not among them. The cutting sun was attempting to reach jump speed when an ancient human corvette, a vessel smaller than her own ship by a factor of 3, closed to point-blank range and put 2 kinetic rounds through her drive section. She died watching her weapons officer try to reroute power to engines that no longer existed, and her last thought was that the humans had been in space for 1,000,000 years and no one had known, no one had even guessed, and that seemed to her, in the last second, like the most catastrophic intelligence failure in the history of her species. Ela watched the survivors run and made no order to pursue. The void, she had learned across her lifetime, was very large, and running into it in a damaged ship was its own kind of sentence. She had other things to attend to. She opened a channel on the frequency her fleet and Earth's defense forces both used, a frequency they had kept synchronized through the signal buoys for 1,100 years, and sent her first communication to a surface-born human in all the years of her life. Earth Defense Command, this is Fleet Commander Ela of the Void Armada. The recall signal has been answered. We have engaged and dispersed the hostile force. Please confirm status of the primary defense perimeter and advise on recovery operations for hegemony vessels requesting rescue. A pause. Also, we'll need to discuss planetary approach protocols. It's been a while since we came this close to home, and I don't want anyone to shoot at us by accident. Admiral Chen stared at the communication for exactly 3 seconds before she made herself respond. Fleet Commander Ela, this is Admiral Chen Wei. The perimeter is intact. All 43 ships combat effective with minimal casualties. Recovery operations are being organized. She stopped. And as for approach protocols, I think we can work something out. Another pause, longer. Welcome back. The battle lasted 19 minutes from first contact to the last hegemony ship clearing the system's jump radius. Of the 612 warships Vorex, 7 had brought, 31 escaped into FTL. 47 were disabled and subsequently taken as prizes. The remaining 534 were destroyed or reduced to debris. Human losses, between Chen's 43-ship force and the Void Armada, totaled 6 ships destroyed and 31 damaged, with crew casualties that would be fully tallied in the recovery operations to follow. It was not a battle, by any conventional definition. It was a lesson. The 31 ships that escaped carried Vorex, 7 aboard the crippled Eternal Verdict, running on primary power alone with its weapons offline and half its crew seeing to the wounded. He stood at his viewport for a long time after the jump, watching the stars rearrange themselves into the unfamiliar patterns of deep space between systems, and he thought about what his sensors had recorded in those 19 minutes. 1,412 ships. Ancient beyond any historical frame he possessed. Crewed by humans who spoke a version of the language his translators barely recognized, who moved through their warships with the easy familiarity of people who had never known any other home, who had fired their weapons with a precision that could only come from training measured not in years but in geological time. He thought about the signal that had recalled them. A signal using a gravitational modulation technology that the hegemony's best physicists had declared theoretically impossible. Sent by a species that had cracked it 1,000,000 years before his civilization had learned to reach the next star. He had walked into this system believing that humanity was a 2,000-year-old spacefaring civilization. A young species. A primitive species that had lucked into FTL and hadn't yet been absorbed or destroyed. He had been wrong in a way that would take the hegemony's historians decades to fully process, because the truth was simultaneously much simpler and much more terrifying than anything his intelligence services had produced. Humanity was not a young species that had recently learned to reach the stars. Humanity was an old species that had reached the stars 1,000,000 years ago and spent that 1,000,000 years quietly, patiently, invisibly becoming something that his fleet had just discovered too late to matter. They were still out there. The ones who had escaped. 31 ships limping home with their tail lights dim. In the Hegemony Council chambers there would be emergency sessions and forensic analysis of sensor records and long careful conversations about what had just happened and what it meant for the next 50 years of expansion policy. There would be voices arguing that this had been a unique circumstance, a trap, an ambush that couldn't be replicated. There would be voices arguing the opposite. Vorex 7, who had been there, who had watched 612 ships become 31 in 19 minutes, already knew how that argument was going to go. In the human solar system, the Ancestor's fist and its 11-kilometer shadow moved slowly toward Earth on a careful approach vector, surrounded by the rest of the Void Armada like a constellation coming home. Ela watched her navigation display as the blue-green dot that her people had heard about in stories, that they had carried in their cultural memory the way other peoples carried memories of fire and harvest, resolved into something real and visible and close. Earth. The origin point. The place her fleet had been built to defend 1,000,000 years ago by hands long returned to the soil. She looked at her crew, at their faces as they watched the screens and saw it for the first time in their lives, and she did not need to say anything about the moment because it was too large for words and her crew understood that. But she said something anyway. 47,000 fleet commanders before me kept us in the void so that we could be there when the signal came. They trained their crews and they maintained their ships and they kept this fleet sharp and ready for 1,000,000 years against a day they never saw. Today was that day. She looked around the bridge, at the screens showing the other Void Armada ships in their approach formation, at the blue world growing larger ahead of them. Let's go home. The Hegemony Dominion, when its council had finished its emergency sessions and its forensic analyses and its long careful conversations, sent no second fleet. It sent, instead, a diplomatic communication on every frequency it could reach, using every translation protocol it possessed, to an address it had previously categorized as a minor system of negligible strategic value. The communication requested, in the most formal language the hegemony's considerable diplomatic tradition could produce, a meeting. A discussion. The possibility of an arrangement. The response came back in 48 hours, jointly signed by Admiral Chenwei and Fleet Commander Ela. It said yes. It also said, with the particular bluntness that apparently ran in human DNA regardless of which branch of the family tree you came from, that the hegemony might want to reconsider any future military assessments of species it hadn't fully researched. It also included, attached as a separate file with no additional commentary, the complete sensor records from 19 minutes of combat. Every ship lost. Every weapon fired. Every impossible speed and gravitic shear and kinetic penetrator and tactical decision made in real time by crews who had been training for this fight for 1,000 generations. The file was titled, simply, in Old Earth script that the hegemony's translation systems took 3 days to render, in case you were wondering. Humanity had been in the void for 1,000,000 years. They had not been sleeping. They had not been drifting. They had been waiting. Building. Learning. Sharpening. Watching the stars with the quiet, patient, utterly implacable attention of a species that had decided, in the very deep past, that it was going to be here for the long run, and had meant it, and had made good on it, and had just, in 19 minutes, proved it to the most powerful military force in this arm of the galaxy in a way that no second fleet would ever come to test again. Not in the lifetimes of anyone now living among the stars. Possibly not in the lifetimes of their children's children's children. The void was very large, but word traveled through it eventually, carried in the data cores of 31 damaged warships limping home to capitals that would have to reckon with a truth they had not been prepared for. There was a species that had been in space for 1,000,000 years. It was humanity. It had come home. And it was not done.